Okay, so these three combine mesh tools here, Boolean, combine, and separate. They do a couple different things, but it's a way that you can combine separate whole objects into a single object. The first one I'm going to talk about is combine here. And it works kind of like group, except uh, it doesn't create a null object that these three separate objects sit inside. It actually will create one polygon mesh from which these three are created from. So if I go up to mesh and just hit combine here, what you'll see is I have these three icons pop up. They're transform nodes, okay? But I have this third object here, this polysphere 3. And whatever the last object that you had selected, that will be the object that becomes the combined object here, okay? So I'm going to actually turn off face mode because I don't necessarily need it on right now. So back down to display polygons, and I'm going to turn off face centers here. And so now I have one whole object. These are all combined together, and I can select it as a whole object. This is different than, let's say, group, right? So let me just create a couple primitives here that I will group instead together. And let me go ahead and go to edit and say group. And so now, here I still have in a hierarchy three distinct objects that are grouped together as opposed to one single object. So I can select here the entire group, but if I'm in the workspace and I select an object here, I'm not selecting the group. I would have to be in the outliner to select the whole group. So it just works a little bit differently, and also you can see that my group, when I've created my group, my pivot point has moved to the origin of the workspace, whereas when I combined everything, it moves down to the center of my object. Let me just actually take this moment to talk about this pivot. One more thing about the pivot, moving the pivot and orienting the pivot. If I want to center this pivot, let's say within this group, I can, because it's off center, but I want it in the center of all of these. Or let's say I'm working here and I've moved my pivot like somewhere else in the scene, and I actually want this pivot to be in the center of this object here. What I can do really simply, I can try to eyeball it, right, by pressing D and moving this around in the viewport, or I can very simply go to Modify, under Pivot, and hit this button here, Center Pivot. And that will center my pivot in the middle of my object. Let me do it here for this group as well. Modify, Center Pivot. Now it centers the pivot here. Okay, so combine is a way that you can bring different separate polygon objects all together into one object. Now, as you can see, I still have these transform nodes, and this is something, these nodes are part of history. So Maya builds a history of the previous actions that you've done. I can actually see this here in the attribute editor, that I have a node here now, this little tab. So I have a packet of information called polyunite. And then after that, I have the different spheres that have been united. And so this is useful because I'm still able to go ahead and access individual parts of my combined mesh. Go back. I'm just hitting Command Z to undo. But let's say this is all extraneous information. If I know that this is the object, this is the object that I want this object. I'm done editing it. I don't want to go in. I don't want to manipulate things. I don't want to transform these individual components any longer. So what I would be doing now is I would go to Edit, and you can see here in the attribute editor what happens when I actually go to delete all the history. So I go to Edit, Delete, All by Type, History, and what it does is it gets rid of all of those transform nodes. So the transform nodes in your outliner disappeared. All that information is basically deleted from the history of Maya. And so now my nodes now are reduced down to the initial 4 nodes. Um, and so now this object is one true whole mesh object. Okay. If I want to break this back apart, I'm actually able to do that even though I've deleted the history. I can go to mesh and say separate. And what this will do is this will populate um, three separate objects, three distinct meshes that are kind of grouped together under this now null object. Okay, so it works kind of like a group, looks exactly the same. So when I separate it, Maya knows, let me just make this a little bit bigger here, my viewport. And I can do that, I don't know if I mentioned this, but you can drag these panels and make them different sizes by hovering right at the border between the two panels and then scaling it. So Maya has, it has kind of like exterior edges. For sphere, all of these edges are exterior, but if I have something like a cube that has, let me go to my polycube here and let me increase my subdivisions. So there's all of these external edges here. So it understands what those are. And we can actually look at that, I believe, by go display polygons again and say border edges. Okay, and I don't know if that necessarily gave me what I'm looking for, but I do want to see my border edges. Let's see if I work in edge mode, if it'll show me. Boop, boop, boop. Let me go back to object mode here and display. That should show me, but I guess it does not. I should be able to see my border edges. Okay, because this is a whole object, it might not be showing me. Let me see. If I'm sorry, just for fun, I'm going to just delete a couple of these faces here. Yeah, it's still not showing me. Okay, anyway, there are all of these kind of exterior border edges, okay, so that make up the outside of this shape. And Maya knows this, and so it will separate these objects out based on where those borders are, where those exterior edges are. And so I have these three distinct shapes now. So even though now I can, recombine. And now I have my object here, and I can go edit, delete all by type history. And now I just have that one object again. So combine and separate are two opposite functions. One separates out a combined object and the other one combines. I'm going to go ahead and delete everything from my scene. And I want to now talk about Boolean. And so a Boolean is like combine, except when I combine, let's say I combine again two objects here. Select both of them and edit mesh, combine. When I combine these two objects, let me show you now in wireframe mode. If I hit 4 on my keyboard, I can see the interior structure of these two objects, that even though there's like complicated internal geometry here now, I have these two distinct objects that have been combined, and all of their mesh information has been maintained, even the stuff that's in the interior. So Boolean works a little bit differently. Let me go back here. and. Let me go ahead and duplicate these two and show you what I mean. So if I combine these two, now you see I have this cube in the interior of my sphere is part of my cube. And if I go to combine this, that gets maintained. So the one whole object, a mesh is really kind of like the exterior skin, but I have some interior stuff too. And that's okay, but it's just a little bit different if I go ahead and Boolean these two. What it's going to do is it's going to combine these two objects into one kind of mesh skin. So let me combine these with a union Boolean. And now you can see that the interior geometry that is hidden within this object that we don't need necessary kind of extraneous information is now deleted here from this object. So from the outside they look the same, but internally they look a little bit different. So this is really powerful with a Boolean because while you can combine two things, two objects, you can also take out chunks of one object from the other. So let's instead go ahead and I'm going to create, let's say, a cylinder and a cone. And I move my cone here, rotate it, rotate a little more. Maybe make it a little bit bigger like that. Okay. So now I can union bool these, but I can also do a difference bool. Okay. So let me select both objects and go up to Boolean and difference. Now what I've done is I've cut a hole through my cylinder with the cone. Okay. So this is a difference bool, and this is a union bool. And it does matter. Let me go back here. It matters which object you select first and second. So the object that you select second is going to influence the object that you've selected first with the difference bool. So if I select this first, and then if I select the cone first and then the cylinder, and I go to mesh Boolean difference, okay, now that cylinder is cutting a hole through my cone. Okay, so those are a couple mesh tools that will allow you to, you would group objects or parent objects in order to organize your scene in a particular way, or also so that you're able to perform more complicated functions in the future. But you can combine using Boolean or using the combine tool. Combine different primitive objects or objects that you've manipulated to pull them into one object or one mesh here.